Hey there! Today we are going to pick up where we left off in the last video and finish the implementation of our crafting window. Now we're going to take a look at the crafting window script. In this script we need a reference to the crafting recipe UI prefab that we created in the last video. We also need a reference to the recipe UI parent, which is the object that's going to have all of the crafting recipe UIs as children of it. In our case, it's the content object of the scroll view. Then we also need a list for crafting recipe UIs. This time it's a list instead of an array, and we're going to discover why in just a moment. Then, as public variables, because we want to be able to change them through code, we have an item container and a list of crafting recipes. We also have the pointer enter and pointer exit events that we assign in the start method by looping through the list of crafting recipe UIs and adding them as listeners to the crafting recipe UIs events. Both in the start and on validate methods, we are calling this init method. What we're doing here is going into the recipe UI parent, basically the content of our scroll view, and doing get components in children of all of the crafting recipe UIs. We are telling it to also search for inactive game objects because they might be disabled and we still want to add them to our list. And then, instead of using the regular method here, we are using an override that receives a list as a parameter and adds all of the results into that list, instead of allocating a new array every time it's called. After we do this, we are calling yet another method with the name update crafting recipes. This is what's going to basically update our UI to match all of the crafting recipes that we add manually or through code into this list. So we're gonna loop through the crafting recipes list, and if we don't have enough crafting recipe UIs, we need to add a new copy of the recipe UI prefab. It's going to be instantiated as a child of the recipe UI parent, and we don't need to change its world position. Why are we comparing the crafting recipe UIs count to the current index? Well, if the number of objects in this list is equal to I, that means we are at the end of the list and we need to add a new object. So if the current index is 0 and we have 0 recipe UIs, then obviously we need to add a new one to accommodate for that object. If we are at index 1 and the count is also 1, that means we need to add a new one because the object at index 1 is the second object and we only have one recipe UI, and etc, etc. And this second if statement right here is just for safety purposes. This should probably never happen with the code that we have right now. But in the case that the list does have enough elements, but the element at the index we want is null for some reason, then instead of adding a new one to the list, we are just going to assign that index to a new object. So when we reach this point, we are sure that the crafting recipe UIs at index I exists and is not null, so we can set its item container to be the item container defined up here in the public variables, and we can also set its crafting recipe to be the crafting recipe at the same index. The second for loop deals with the case that we have more recipe UI objects than we have crafting recipes, so we are going to start at the last crafting recipe, or rather the last plus one, and for every recipe UI that we have beyond that, we are simply going to set it to null, which will deactivate the objects. As you remember, if we go into the set crafting recipe method, down here when we assign null to the crafting recipe, it's going to set active false. Going back to Unity, we can now add the crafting window script to our crafting window object, and we need to give it the reference to the recipe UI prefab. We need to tell it which object is the parent of the recipe UIs. And then we also need to give it all of the crafting recipes that we want to make available to use through this crafting window. I'm going to click the lock button in the upper right corner of the inspector. Then I'm going to select all of the crafting recipes that I've already created, and I will drag them all into the crafting recipes array. And there you have it. It has automatically updated all of the crafting recipe UIs to have all of our crafting recipes and the item icons that correspond to them, and it has created enough recipe UI objects to fit all of them. We should also set the reference to the item container to be the player's inventory. Other than that, you might want to make the crafting window a prefab too. To finish this up, we also need to add to the character script a reference to the crafting window. And by the way, I moved the character script from the character panel game object into its own player game object, just to make things a little bit more organized, because the character panel is now a prefab. So let's go inside the character script, and we need to add a serialized field variable of type crafting window just under the inventory and equipment panel variables. And we need to go into the start method, and give me just a second because I'm going to talk about this now being a start method and not an awake. And in here, we need to add listeners to the onPointer enter and onPointer exit events to show and hide the tooltips respectively, just like we did for the inventory and the equipment panel. This will make it so that tooltips will work in the crafting window too. So let's talk about this being a start method instead of an awake. Previously, when we had our character, inventory, and equipment panel classes all with start methods, we ran into a bug where the events would not be assigned in the correct order, causing our slots to not detect any input from our mouse. To fix that, we need our scripts to run in a pretty specific order. We need the character to run first and add listeners to these events. Then we need the inventory, equipment panel, and now the crafting window to run after that and add listeners to their events. And finally, we need the crafting recipe UI to run and add listeners to the events. But Unity doesn't know this, and if all scripts have a start method, the order in which each of those methods is going to run is completely random, so we need a way to control that. One way to do that is to use the awake method, which is guaranteed to always run before start. But that only allows for 2 levels of control. And before we had the crafting window, that was good enough because we had the character script at level 1, and then the inventory and equipment panel at level 2. Now we also have the crafting window at level 2, but we have the crafting recipe UIs at level 3. So we need a way to better control that. And we do. In Unity, you can change script execution order by going into the Edit menu, selecting Project Settings, and then Script Execution Order. This will open up a new window in the inspector, where you can change the order that scripts execute. If you need to add a new script to this list, you can just click the plus button down here, select the script that you want to add, and then drag it to be above or below any other scripts. If you drag it on top of the section that says default time, you will basically just remove it from this list. For our case, we just need the character script to run before everything else. After that, the inventory, equipment panel, and crafting window, they can run in any order between those 3, but they need to be after the inventory. And then the crafting recipe UI needs to run after all of those. And finally, after all of these changes, we should have our crafting window working. If we go into play mode, and we try to craft the first recipe, which needs a chest armor and a gem, precisely what we have in our inventory, then we can see that we turned the chest armor into the chest armor +1. Hooray! I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace!